Welcome to the Creative Industry Insight podcast, a podcast that looks at various roles in the creative world. I'm your host, Bobby. Today's guest, sound designer Wayne Pashley, joins us to talk about their work on Elvis. Please be warned, there are heavy spoilers in this episode, so sit back and relax as we jump into the conversation with Wayne. Hi, Wayne. Thank you for joining me today.
It's an absolute pleasure, Rob. Thank you for having me.
And I'm excited to talk to you about your work on Elvis. I watched it again over the weekend with my other half, and yeah, we really enjoyed it. It was really good, and kind of excited to dive into the world of sound design for it, especially with such a film that's so vast over time, and it's a music, with especially a music biopic where you have there's just a lot going on. So I'm quite interested to dive in, but I think congrats is like in order first because I saw that you were shortlisted for the Academy for Best Sound. I'm
Right.
sure there's probably some other awards that I've missed off as well from the top of my head. Which what does it feel like to get some recognition and getting all the plaudits?
Oh, wow. Well, look, honestly, when I think about the Elvis journey, which was started many years ago after The Great Gatsby with when Baz Luhrmann first muted the idea that he was going to do it, I was super excited, as you can imagine. I was a big Elvis fan all my life, really. And to get to a point where the film gets released at Cannes, which I think is like May or June, and then we all thought, the whole team, the music team, sound team, editorial, and Baz, I'm sure, we all thought that, the film could potentially be forgotten by this time of year with this award season situation, which I frankly haven't experienced this sort of like level before. And I got to say, thanks to Baz and his energy and the way that he's been promoting the whole event over the past several months, with the help of obviously Warner Brothers, it's amazing how we're still in the conversation. I was quite surprised that we're still here. I'm very pleased that we're still here, of course, because there's some enormous sound work that is done this year with other movies, from the Top Guns to the Pinocchios to all. Well, I don't need to go through them. You know what they are. So yeah, it's a great joy to be part of that conversation, I've got to say. Thank you.
Am I right in thinking that you'll need to do some sort of bake-off, or is that something? Was that more to do with like visual effects and
No, it
makeup
is a
design?
it is a bake-off situation. The shortlist came out, and to be honest, I didn't know what that meant in terms of bake-off. Anyway, I've since found out that so we had to do a video presentation of a 10-minute clip that we chose, and we chose the Elvis Rustwood sequence because we felt that it was best between the all the sort of heads of department with David Lee and the mixing team with Andy Nelson and Michael Keller. We decided that was the best clip to present because it was kind of like a great showcase for each department, because you not only had the live music, you had all the crowds, you've got enormous sound design happening within the music and telling the story of Elvis being the first punk, basically, and what the fear that he put into the establishment in the late 1950s. And so we chose that we were allowed to have 10 minutes, which is what we've done. And I believe that the Bake Off happens this Sunday in the United States and various other cities. So yeah, so that's what's happening. So we did our little video thing, and there it is. Yeah.
No, that sounds great. I always I guess the idea of a bake-off is always, if you say that to somebody normal, it's just like you're gonna bake some cakes. So you need to,
Yeah. That's right.
maybe
If
if you
you're
did that, it'd be like a bit of a bribe though. So
Well, if you're in Australia, and you do a pavlova, I don't know if you know what a pavlova, but that's kind of what sprung to mind.
it's like, where do I begin with this? Um,
Yeah.
so let's go back. So how did the project come about, and what was it that made you want to take it on?
Oh, wow. Well, I've worked with Baz for 30 years. I started with him on Strictly Ballroom, his first picture. And, we've been collaborating ever since. And when, like I said earlier, Baz first muted it at the very end of The Great Gatsby, that he was thinking of doing it, the story of Elvis. And with that excitement and everything, I kind of thought, wow, let's see what happens. And here we are 5 years later. So when Baz came to us, he came to my studio here and kind of like pitched it in a way. I hadn't read the script or anything, and he pitched the idea of what he wanted to do. And I was thinking that it was going to be like a slice of Elvis's life, but not his entire life. So to fit that into a 2.5 hour or whatever it is, 240 or whatever it is, movie, I thought, now there's an enormous challenge ahead. And of course, with that, my mind was reeling with, what is Elvis? Well, it's the music, it's the crowds, it's the guitars, it's the cars, it's all the stuff. I've been to Graceland many years ago and traveled by myself in a great big car from New York, and it was just, so I went on a pilgrimage. So I know, I had a great love for it. Yeah, so that's how it all started. And we got into production, well, about to get into production, and then, of course, COVID hit. And the production got shut down. Tom Hanks got sick. He went home. And we sort of thought, well, now, we don't know what's going to happen. But, of course, Austin Butler decided to stay in Australia and stay in character and keep rehearsing himself in the voice, in the singing, the movement, all that stuff. And I think really in many ways, for without Austin's, tenacious attitude to say, no, we're going to do this. And then, of course, Tom's love for it as well. When he got well, his schedules changed and clashed, and COVID was still happening. He said, yeah, let's do it. So we were blessed, really, that things happened, because really all the sets were built. And this all happened 3 days out from the shoot. So, the studio came and shut, put locks on all the on all the sound stages, and we thought, well, what's going to happen now? So yeah, very blessed that it did come about. But that's how it started, really.
I think it's quite funny when you think about a few years ago with COVID and how so much uncertainty happened, especially in the world, but also in our industry with what's happens now. But I guess, as you said, with people's dedication and actually basically being like a bullhead, just pushing through
Well,
to
that's
sort of
right.
continue.
Well, that's right. And if for Austin to take on Elvis Presley, what a terrifying prospect, for an actor to do that, and to get the support of the Presley family and everything. I mean, Elvis Presley is an unprecedented figure in 20th century music and popular culture. So, when you think about Elvis as a brand, he's bigger than Coke, or as big as
Yeah.
Coke, and kind of go, well, there's an almighty role for any actor. So yeah, he dug in deep, and the studio went with us.
But as you said, like with Elvis being such a big brand, when you watch the film, you forget that it's not just music, but it's also all the merchandise,
Oh,
all the films that he was in. And as you said, being like the first sort of punk, there's just so
yeah.
much that you kind of sometimes you forget, just like, wow, like,
Well, that's huge. And if you imagine the attitudes back in the 50s, when this guy came out on stage, from all his influences whilst growing up in the black community and all that, and he combined R&B and gospel and country into this fusion. No one had ever heard anything like that before. And then, of course, the hip wiggling and all the bits. So to see that sort of hysteria take place, not just from women, I might add. Yeah, it was a phenomena. And of course, you can't dismiss Colonel Tom Parker and what he did. A kind of a genius in his own right. I mean, in that sort of marketing, that sort of ability to sell. Because really, Colonel Tom Parker was the biz, and Elvis was the show. And there it is, they're right there. And as the movie points out, it became this Faustian pact in many ways, And of course, then the Shakespearean tragedy. And we sort of saw, we saw it with Marilyn Monroe, like a woman who was that immense on the world stage. Yeah, so there you go. So it's pretty huge stuff for and not just Austin Butler, for Baz to take on. I mean, what a massive undertaking.
Especially when you mention as well, like a film about his life up to a certain point, and then rather than just like snapshots of his life. So like when they did, I think it was like what, Presley and Nixon, or Elvis and Nixon, like the
Yeah,
meeting between them, just a sort of film. But with the film spanning over so many decades and the time periods that you need to create in terms of sound, and making sure that one sound sounds authentic for the 50s, another for the 60s, and so on.
yeah.
Where do you begin with that, and what is your process in the research and then to the creating stage?
Well, the first step was really to start listening to Elvis's performances, listening to the music, seeing, as wonderful as those old 50s tracks are, we kind of knew that you couldn't really go a Dolby Atmos movie, especially a Baz Luhrmann movie, where everything is larger than life, and really Baz has got his own genre when it comes to that, this kind of like operatic thing. So we started going through the music, started here, and we were working very closely with the music department. We soon realized what we had to do was, once we knew that Austin, it could sing completely like Elvis Presley, we knew that really we had, with the 50s, we were going to go full tilt Austin. Then when we hit the 60s with the 68 comeback special, the NBC special, it's so well known that we wanted to maintain Elvis's track as much as possible. It was a bit messy, it was mono, but we had to then expand upon that. So, looking at that and then seeing how we're going to do it. And then, of course, into the 70s, we had the RCA masters that were recorded in those Vegas venues. So we had some form of split stems. And no matter how you looked at it, we kind of went, well, we have to use the same microphones, number one. So we fully restored each of the three periods for the mics. And so then Austin was going to use those on set. Austin sang every song, every performance right through. So we had the ability to cross match. And then, of course, then the music department enhanced the musical track in order to get Dolby Atmos. In terms of the effects and all that, we recorded everything we could lay our hands on. So in the last 2 weeks of production, I went up to Queensland, where they were shooting the film, and all the vehicles were all still there. All the amplifiers, all the gear that had been restored were there. So I recorded everything I could lay my hand on. And so we did that. And then, of course, the crowds were its own massive thing, because the crowds were so thematically important to the story, because ultimately Elvis had a huge love for the audience, and the audience were just completely, they had a fervor and a hunger for him. And some may say in the story, of course, that did we kill him at the end of the day? And so what we did was we went through a lot of those recordings that were live, listened to where the crowds were and how they were reacting. Sometimes if it was the same set, like let's say same sort of a musical set in a Vegas performance where there was repeat, you could hear where the crowds were reacting to him. So we replicated that. In some cases, we actually pulled that material out of the archives and then rebuilt it. We had 500 strong extras on set. So we recorded all of those whilst the shoot was going on as well in Ambisonics. So we had the full surround immersion, because that was one of the big things for Baz, was not to get crowd fatigue. That was really important, how to deal with that, but to have the crowds, the keening that was needed for that thematic love for him. That was a big challenge as well. So with all the things, what we did with the 50s, also 50s, 60s and 70s, Baz does a very like a montage heavy narrative to pull that whole life story into a feature film, acceptable length. There's a lot of montage stuff. So what we did, he coined the term poetic glue, which was visually going to help bridge the movement and the style and the pace. So with that poetic glue came all those visual effects and wipes and all that sort of business. To join up with that, we then came up with sonic glue. And now what we did with that was we actually went through and researched a lot of those time periods. And we got real life commentary, real life headlines, and re-recorded it. So, from everything from from Hank Snow to the Memphis Mafia guys, all that stuff that were either talked about Colonel Tom Parker, talked about Elvis and his life, or even stuff where rock and roll has got to go, that famous quote, all redone. The clearance legally was huge for Warner Brothers, but that is part of our sonic glue that is transitional, and it's those words and that dialogue is swirling throughout the effects. So you don't catch everything, obviously, that's said, but you can feel it, and like turned it into an archive piece that was going to tie the thing together. So there were just some of the ideas that we had to as Baz called it, he wanted this sonic architecture that was like, tiles in a mosaic, and to make it into an audio visual whirlwind. And so, so that were just some of the things that we did, It was a big job.
Just sort of trying to dissect your answer a little bit, because it is, I think, going back to what you originally said, getting the mono recordings, which, correct me if I'm wrong, but it's not something we really do now. So if you had to stitch something like that into the film, I'm guessing that created a lot of sort of, not problems, but hurdles that you needed to clear.
Absolutely. Well, the big one there was we realized that when Austin first did the camera tests, we were with him and we had recording. We had cameras there with Mandy Walker, and we did playback tests to make sure that we're all going to be in sync and how Austin was going to be able to lip sync. So that was all fine. By lunchtime, Baz came in and said, "Okay, that's all working, lovely, lovely. Okay, now let's get in a live band." So everyone scrambled, got to get a drummer, a double bass player, a guitarist, and bring in a Shure 55 microphone, the live mic. Now we knew that that Austin was already singing whilst we were doing playback. So now cutting playback, we just let him go. And it was an extraordinary event because at that time, Baz, end of the day, we felt like we were watching Elvis Presley. So we decided that the 50s had to be completely Austin, right? So that is him. It's completely rebuilt. Obviously, the timing and the tempo of the tracks are faster than they were back in the 50s. But to get that whole, like we said, punk feeling, it was completely redone by Austin, which was amazing. When it came to the 68 comeback, which was mono, that was terrifying because during the shoot, Austin sang as well, but we were able to mix and match Elvis and Austin seamlessly because we had the same microphone, but also Austin was a secret weapon. He sounded like Elvis. So as soon as from the original he went off mic, we could fill it with Austin. Austin then did all the breaths, all the movement, all the vox that went with it to make it feel real. Then, because the music was so thin, we then overlaid. So the real track is there, but then the composing team, redid the bass, the drums, and we just fed on top to give us an immersive experience for a modern audience. So yes, the mono was pretty tough. And in fact, that 68 comeback, I think we probably mixed it a dozen times before we settled on it. And of course, the crowds helped a lot as well to help sell the energy. So that's sort of part of the process, really.
We're talking about the crowd of the energy. So I was listening to another interview that you did, and somebody had mentioned that you got Scream Queens on later on, which is something that never really occurred to me until somebody had that they had mentioned it. So I guess the backstory behind it is that the people screaming in the shows were actually recorded in another way, if I'm right, as in they weren't actually screaming on set, but they were done in post, correct?
Well, no, it's a bit of a mix, actually. The first hayride sequence, there was about 500 extras in there, and out of the extras and the young women, Baz selected those who could scream the most. Now, a scream is not just a scream. A scream of love and excitement and that full energy is different to a horror scream. So, like, we went through libraries and all that sort of stuff to try and find as many screams, and nothing worked because they were wrong. So what we did, so the stuff from set is in the movie, in that hayride sequence. We then got some of those young actresses back, and they did extras. Then we did another layer from Loop Group in post. So we did like an 80-hour run of these incredible, voice actors from Barbara Harris's team in the United States. We did about 8 sessions, not just of screaming, but with Barbara and her team across the whole movie. But yeah, so those initial women from set were known as the Scream Queens. They went through a training program. They went through class in order to how to maintain their voice and not blow out after 5 minutes, because you can imagine, I think that scene itself was shot over 3 or 4 days. So you can imagine that those young women had to keep doing that stuff. Yeah, that's where the Scream Queens came from. They actually went through college, and how to do it.
So, like, I was just picturing about the library. If you're selecting screams, I can imagine that you could have a little bit of fun and be like, "Wow, this film could be totally different if we use
Well, it could
this
be.
screeching, this like
Well,
ear-piercing
that's
screech."
well, it was kind of tricky because when you start thinking about that sort of mania that's going on, my first initial thought was the Beatles, and that whole Beatlemania thing. That stuff doesn't really exist in any sort of library. I don't know. You remember Hard Day's Night and stuff, and all those women are screaming down the street after them. It's like that. It doesn't exist. So we had to build it in order to create the environment, and also hopefully to get it immersive. So when you're watching the film in a cinema, that you feel like you're actually witnessing Elvis Presley.
I'm also just I was just curious as well. When you have, because there'll be scenes where somebody will scream and then more and more people would scream. How do you build that layer wise in terms of, like, you obviously have your main scream and then your secondary and then a group of screams, but how do you build it that you don't, when you get to like the everybody screaming, not for it to like take control of your sound design, not for it to
That's
take away from what's happening from the music and on stage?
correct. Yeah. Well, again, it took quite a while. And because we went through about 5 temp mixes prior to the final mix, it was a slow discovery. It was a testing, too much, this much, whatever. And of course, with the editorial team, Jonathan Redmond and Matt Villa, the rhythms of the cut, against the musical track started to tell us where the timing of that stuff should be. Because, like, for example, that hayride sequence, it was funny because you had Marion jump up and scream as the topper. So you had to find your way and not overwhelm. And that goes for all the scenes. When you go into Rustwood Stadium for the trouble sequence, it was very easy to sort of go, okay, we're entering Rustwood Stadium. We know the Colonel's worried because, he's had the threats from the establishment that they're going to jail Elvis if he doesn't pull his head in, all those things. And it was very, very sort of tempting to start the sequence where all those women clamber over the police car, to make it big from the top. But we just held our fire, with the music, and felt the emotional pull. And it just took time. That's all, and sometimes we sort of went way too far, and then others, seemed to work pretty well from the outset. But yeah, it was a big challenge again, all those crowds, and the tracks were enormous, where we had, what we call, like the primary crowd layer, the spots, the detail, and then you went to like a bit like an orchestra, where you had like the closer crowds as a group, then the mid crowds a little bigger, the wider crowds, on other pre-dub levels, and then of course the ultra wide. So we had enough ability as we pre-dub them to make those stems work for the final. So, so yeah, it was a lot of planning with that, and how best to and not get tangled up. When someone was too loud at a given moment, for example, and it can be piercing, obviously, where you've EQ'd, you've rolled off, the top end of those screams, but I knew where everything was, and how best to contain it as we were going forward. Yeah, a lot of planning, really.
As you said, especially when you're playing on something like Dolby Atmos, where it is just so immersive, but you don't want to take away from what's going on with the performance. I do have a question. I do have a question about you're talking about recording Austin play live and then bringing a band in, and then if you have multiple takes, you can basically pick and choose a second by
Yeah.
second which is the best to add it all together. But what sort of hurdles did you have to face whilst recording music live that there's so much going on because there is so many different instruments and everybody literally has to be on point with each take effectively.
Well, that's right. The sequence. Well, first of all, David Lee, our production mixer, was using a 32 channel Scorpio from Sound Devices. So we had the music playback there all the time coming in, time code and all that, and then he had everybody mic'd up. Now he just had to roll and roll and roll. For example, the scene where what we called the rehearsal before Vegas, where you see Austin as Elvis going through each of the parts before we get onto the Elvis stage. That was always planned for playback. Austin had rehearsed that sequence for a playback situation. So for David Lee, he was basically miking up originally just for the dialogue as we were going. But it just wasn't working for Baz or for Austin. For some reason, on the day going through that sequence, it just wasn't working. And then, of course, Baz made the call. We're going live. So where you had the drums and everything muted, or where you had all the instruments sort of softened and muted in order to get the dialogue, now we're on completely. All the trombones, everything. That is recorded completely live. So it's a major rig, it's a big flip out. You had to work out, with the help of the music department, where best to record the drums, where best to record the backing vocalists, how to separate and how to make that work. And that happened a lot. And of course, by having that multi-track, like in the 70s, for example, of live recording, as well as the RCA masters, that it was all done in post. Okay, where do we need it? What levels are going to help sell the bottom end? Like when you've got the drummer, who was just extraordinary, our live drummer, he was absolutely on point. So where the RCA masters didn't have the energy or the excitement, in came our live drums. And it was, absolutely accurate. So yeah, it's a big deal. David Lee copped the lion's share of all that. and of course, we had the playback masters that we'd recorded, the music department had recorded in Nashville across the whole period of the development of the film as well. So it was a massive mixed bag. And you put your best foot forward with the musical infrastructure for the final mix, but that doesn't mean you're locked in. Not once all these sound effects, all the crowds, all the dialogue comes into play, and now things start to change. So yeah, a lot of tracks. Does that sort of make sense?
I think so. Yeah, I think it's just, I guess, the way that I'm sort of picturing it on my mind on that's like the output, sorry, is that you have one line that's going to be the vocals, another line that's guitar, another
Yes.
line is drums, and
Yeah,
sort of merging
right.
them all together.
Exactly. So everything's separated across that recorder, and the backing vocalists, and of course Austin as well. And now we've got the ability in time with Elvis Presley playback and every instrument as well. So we had basically the choice on the day.
No, and that's cool as well to hear in terms of just the layers that you can create and what you can sort of take away from each
Yeah.
take and how they're going to sound. And then also if you have masters, um,
Yes.
I guess you can kind of compare to like what's come from before to what's now, and then
Yeah.
just tweak it to make it sound a little bit more of the time, shall we
Well,
say?
exactly right. And also it enabled us to, because we had stems from RCA of a lot of those performances, we could take Elvis's vocal track, and actually time compress for sync. So to match Austin himself, instead of going Austin to Elvis, we went Elvis to Austin. So everything was spot on in sync, and use one or the other. So that was the beauty there. But obviously in the 50s and all that stuff, it was just much better to have Austin just do it all, and it's completely him.
Yeah, which is amazing to think because it's not just the acting, as you said, the dancing and the performing. It's also the distinct voice that he
Well,
needs to recreate. And
yeah,
he,
and also,
I would
yeah.
wonder how many hours he must have put in just to
Oh,
get that
that's
sound.
That's right, because it's not only the singing side of things, it's actually the dialogue and all the interstitial moments of Elvis's character. I remember we had one moment in when we were doing post ADR work with Austin, and there was a moment in a scene where he laughs, like Elvis just laughs, and it was off mic or something like that. And I think it was a scene with, I think possibly with Priscilla, and I said to Austin, "Look, can we fix this laugh because it's gone off mic or it's distorted? I can't remember, something like that." And he said, and he looked at it, and he was such a hard worker. And he said, "Yeah, yeah, no worries." And he had a look at the scene and went, "Right." And then he went to his laptop and he had the breakdown and videos of Elvis Presley in all manner of delivery, dialect, dialogue, laughter, all those things, whether it was his kung fu fighting sounds, whatever. And he went to a whole bunch of Elvis laughter track and just replicated it. I was amazed. He would listen to his laptop video of Elvis and just and repeat it. And you just go, wow, okay. Now, this is a man that is prepared. Talk about research.
And that's just a clip of a laughter. Like, what else he probably looked
Exactly.
into? And I wonder how many recordings he must have of himself just doing the voice and
Oh,
getting the mannerisms and the just the right sound for it.
yeah, and
Insane.
aside from that, and the movement, like the movement. I remember I was talking to Polly, who was the choreographer, and Polly, wonderful British woman who came from Bohemian Rhapsody. So she had done, worked with Remy Malik doing Queen, doing all that, and then came on to Elvis and had to help Austin and do the movement coaching. And she was saying that Elvis is just absolute. It was harder for her, and it was just so unique. And it's not like Elvis ever had a set sort of pattern of movement. He completely just felt the music. So whatever came out just came out, and Austin had to learn all that as well. I mean, blimey, yeah.
I know, but even for Polly going from Freddie Mercury to Elvis, that's not too bad on your CV to say
Oh
that
yeah,
you got
yeah,
those,
that's
you
right.
helped create all those movements, especially
That's
as you said,
yeah.
Elvis just felt the music.
Well, that's right. That's right. Yeah.
And just curious as well, what was your favorite scene to create the sound for?
Oh, look, honestly, I think probably the Rustwood sequence was one of my favorites. I loved the because that had all the energy of the punk, but it also had the other story, which was the FBI and all the police that were dramatically going to arrest him and put him away if he broke the law and broke and encouraged the kids to break the segregation lines at the time. So that was fantastic because everything's story driven. So, and the other thing too is Baz never sits on any one idea for very long at all. It's a constant handover of music to dialogue to sound effects to, he's constantly handing the baton like a relay race and building. So that was a great one. Really enjoyed also creating Beale Street when he was a youngster and going down in that whole black community and the feel of the place. Like it's, nowhere on earth was like that, where those clubs and the musicians in the beginning of rock and roll was actually taking place. And that went through several iterations because before Doja Cat came on, with Shonka, who was doing Hound Dog. We went through like plans of, like a bit like Baby Driver, where all the sound effects were in time and obviously in key to the music. So it was almost like everything was in harmony, everything was in rhythm. And that still exists today, but of course it does take. Baz is very iterative with his filmmaking. One version of the film you have this week could be completely different to next week. But then when Doja Cat came on board and that wonderful rap came in, it changed again. So, but that was a lot of fun. I actually really also love the dramatic ending of the film, where everything does calm down, and you are with slowly going. The soundtrack is promoting a similar thematic and emotional sort of like demise. I really loved that area, from the manic stuff at the beginning and where we had to take it to basically following Elvis's emotional journey. So yeah, look, I love working on the film. Full stop, right across.
I think as well, when you're talking about the change near the end, it's like it goes from, that's when it's sort of like you have to face the music, but that music stops, and then there's more to all of this than just rock and roll and living that
Yeah.
sort of rock and roll lifestyle. I love, do you know what, that Beale Street, because there's so much going on sound wise.
Yeah,
Because as you said, there's the performance of, is it
Big
BB
Mama Thorpe.
King? Yeah,
Oh,
big as well. He's there as well, and then you can have the crowd going crazy, being like, "Oh my gosh, is that Elvis?" And then adding in a soundtrack as well of Doja Cat, which I'm curious about as well. Sorry, just like that you mentioned, is that when you have like your side of the when you have your side of the mix in terms of what's happening on screen, and then you have the soundtrack that comes in, what is the process and procedure so that the sound design and the soundtrack don't cross or like overshadow one another?
right, understood. Well, here was the thing. Baz's rules, if you like, was that sound design and music had to be a singular vision across the course of the film. So very, very early on, before any shoot took place, I got together with Elliot Wheeler, the composer, and his team, which was Jamison Shaw and Evan McHugh, who was mixing a lot of those, music tracks. And Jamison is an incredible producer in himself, like where he on the soundtrack album, for example, you'll hear a lot of his work. Now, what we decided, inclusive of editorial, it was a constant handover. So we'd receive a sequence, a Doja Cat would appear, which was now different to being just Shonka Duvray doing Hound Dog. We now got a combination. So all of a sudden, all of my team here, which are just extraordinary, would have to take the new edit, the new track, rebuild a similar concept if it was going to work, or throw it out altogether, and rebuild, look at changing the pitch of the car horns or the vehicles themselves, or even the crowds that were actually in time. So they're kind of calling out to each other, for example, in Beale Street during the day there, and it all had to be rebuilt again. Then we'd send it back to the music department. They do a little bit of their magic, and then we'd come back into a temp mix, and then I'd have Baz with me, and we'd work out what we're going to do, and that's lovely. That's temp mix number one. Then we'd go forward with the cut number two. Next thing would happen where you go, oh, it's changed again. It's come down in length or whatever, or new ideas come about. So, like I said, with Baz being very iterative like that, you're never going to be comfortable, and the ideas will never stop until you're told to stop and the time's run out. But basically, Baz has such a wonderful network of incredible artists around the world. From one minute to the next, we're in the final mix of the movie, and Baz comes in and says, "Oh, look, guys, we're going to change the end credits." Because Dr. Dre is next door looking at the film with Eminem, and they're going to do a track for us. And you go, hang on a minute, that's just across the hall. And that's just an example of what happens. Like with Chris Isaak, and Stevie Nicks, that opening music of Sandman's Coming, which was it's a funny little tune that came from one of Elvis's films. I think it wasn't Speedway, it was a Roustabout maybe. Anyway, funny little tune that Baz wanted to use as a concept for Colonel Tom Parker. Sandman's coming. He's going to, Snowman's coming. He's going to snow job you. I remember when Baz said, what are we going to do? And Baz spoke to one of his music producing friends in Hollywood, and they was at lunch, and he then goes, oh, hang on a minute, Chris Isaak loves this sort of stuff. And boom, next thing you know, Chris Isaak is on with Stevie Nicks doing that opening. With the Hank Snow song in the beginning. Yeah, David Wenham, wonderful performer, but he was doing it to playback because David Wenham wasn't going to be able to do Hank Snow's style. Next thing we know, we also find out that Chris Isaak loves Hank Snow over the phone, sings to Baz, oh, like this. It happened to be the same song, just happenstance. And of course, that evening, Chris Isaak went home, recorded Hank Snow. Now it's in the movie. I know. It's like,
Wow.
Yeah. So that's the sort of thing that happens, which is always keeps you on your toes, and it's also very exciting.
I'm just sort of wondering how Baz is just like comes in to say, "Don't worry, Dr. Dre and Eminem are gonna do the end credits." It's just like, I wonder how that conversation happened. Was it just like, "Oh yeah, hey guys, yeah, just doing this film. Do you want to come have a look?" Or I just,
Pretty much. I think Baz has got a wonderful collaborator, Anton Monstead, who was his music supervisor, worked with him for many, many years. And Anton's amazing. And he basically, reaches out to these people, and Baz either knows them or maybe not at the time. And then Baz does the sell, and then, next thing you know, they're jumping on board because how fun is that to work on a Baz film?
yeah, no, it just seems like the sort of, I don't know. I can imagine him at parties being the person that talks to everybody and just goes up with just he will strike up a conversation with anybody, anywhere, everywhere. Like if he was on the train, I bet he would be talking to that person buried in their book or
Yeah.
phone.
Yeah.
That's just what it just seems like. He has like the
Yep.
gift of the gab sort of thing.
Oh, yeah.
But then on top of that as well, mentioning about the Hank Snow music and how there was playback on that. But then on top of that, that the composer sort of just picked a random song that was the same song that they both had in
I know.
mind. And it's
Yeah.
just like that just shows how well you guys are all in sync in a weird way.
That exactly right. Exactly right. The manipulation that the music team had to do, obviously, for sync for David Wenham singing Hank Snow was not Chris had the tempo and everything, but it wasn't that difficult to even get in sync. At the end of the day. Yeah, I've not spoken to Dave Wenham about that, what he thinks of Chris Isaak singing for him, but that's pretty funny.
Do you know what? I bet you he doesn't know. I bet you, I bet you, I bet you he doesn't know. He'll find
Yeah,
out and he'll be like,
yeah,
oh,
I'll find out one day. That's the sort of stuff that happens that that you've always you can never really rest on your laurels and pretend that what you've done on one temp mix is going to stick. You just keep going, and you keep coming up with and keep catching up basically with the ideas and the change of energy and the edit and all that stuff. It's
and I
pretty special, really.
and I think that is a perfect way to end the episode. But I do have one last question just for fun. You did your pilgrimage to Graceland, and this might be a little bit unfair question to ask, but what's your favorite Elvis song?
Oh, that's not an unfair question. I like this. I've got many, but I have to say it's I Can't Help Falling in Love because it ended up being my the theme to my wife and I's wedding. And in fact, on our wedding ring here, we have it inscribed, "Take my hand, take my whole life too." So that I have to say is probably one of my favorites. And but I've got so many, really. I just adore the music and and the joy that he's brought to me.
I didn't think you could top the ending of this episode, but I think you just topped it with that answer as well. Wayne, thank you very much for joining me.
Absolute pleasure, Rob.
I really appreciate you taking the time to talk to me, even with the crazy time zones. But yeah, again, thank you so much. For anyone interested, Elvis is out now. You could buy it on DVD, Blu-ray, 4K, stream it on Amazon. I think in the US, it's being streamed on HBO Max. Please go out and yeah, enjoy the experience.
Thank you so much, Rob. And I know it's so early in the morning for you.
I'll uh, I'll suffer it for gold like this. Thank you again, Wayne.
Thank you, mate.
All right, take care. Bye bye.
Cheers. Bye bye. Thanks so much.
Thank you for listening. Please subscribe, rate, and review this podcast.